everyone, and welcome to session 6. I'm Ashley McLeod-Moore, and I'm going to be moderating the 6th session today. If you've attended the earlier sessions, you know if you want to have any questions throughout the presentations, go ahead and type those questions into the Q&A, and we will answer those after Dr. Christa presents. But now we're going to hear from Dr. Dave Abeler, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ashley, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today and to talk then about resilience in food supply chains and then some research that some colleagues and I are doing at Penn State then to advance this goal of resilience. The next slide, please. So the outline of my talk then will consist of 3 main topics. First of all, just a discussion of where things are at 6 months or more then into COVID-19. A little bit about what went wrong and the lack of supply chain resilience, and we'll talk about particular industries there. And then what we can do right now, what the guidance that we can have from research, and what that research then says that we can do to improve resilience in food supply chains. So the next slide, please. So the current status of U.S. food supply chains is certainly better than this spring, but still far from the pre-COVID normal. And a good example of that then is dairy supply chains. And so the next slide, please. And dairy supply chains were among the most seriously disrupted by COVID-19. The pictures that you're seeing here then actually are from Florida this spring. The one on the bottom then of milk trucks dumping their milk. And then the one in the upper right then was a picture of a Publix store in Florida, and empty shelves then where dairy products would normally be stocked. And so what you saw with dairy then was a combination then of both collapsing prices at the farm level, and that's the green line then in the chart on the left, combined then with a scarcity of product at the retail level and rising prices at the retail level, and that then being the light green line then at the top and on the chart on the left, and the middle line there then being wholesale prices, which also took a dip. And as you can see then, and as the chart indicates, as of this summer then, the prices at the farm level had largely recovered, but are still then about 5% lower than they were at the beginning of the year. And so, again, dairy supply chains, much has been worked out, but there's still some ways to go. The next slide, please. Meat supply chains then also suffered some severe shocks, as I think we're all well aware just from being grocery shoppers ourselves. And there were a number of then meat plants which were closed due to outbreaks of COVID-19. And you can see in the upper right then kind of a list showing then in different states the number of plants that were closed. Most of these plants then have since reopened. Some continue to remain closed. The chart then on the left shows the meat production in 2020, which is the blue line, compared to meat production then on a monthly basis in 2019 as a point of comparison. And you can see that the most severe shock then to meat production occurred in April and May of this year as those plants were closed. And there were some high profile plant closures. Plants then that accounted for a significant proportion then of total U.S. meat production. Meat production has largely recovered, and the rationing which stores then had imposed in the spring, and there's a picture of that then of a grocery store in Pennsylvania called Redner's, which is in the lower right. Those are largely over, but still there are ongoing issues then with meat supply chains. And the next slide, please. And if we look at food service supply chains, then we can see the collapse in demand, which I think we all witnessed personally, due to the closing, of course, of restaurants, and then the reopening, which was discussed in the previous section, which still isn't quite complete. Restaurants being limited to either, delivery and pickup, or where they've reopened to the public capacity limits. Of 50% in some states, 25% in others. Pennsylvania, for example, is currently at 25% and will later this month go to 50%. And then the closing of schools in March of this year as well. And the figure then in the upper right shows the status of school openings and closures as of the fall of this year. Most states then are leaving it up then to local school districts. Those are the yellow shaded states. And some districts then are reopening with students attending every day of the week. Others are having students attend. Some students attend some days, others attend other days. And then some states then are going entirely online. And you can see then the collapse in food service sales in the chart on the left from about $60 billion at the start of this year in the month of January down to about $30 billion in April. It's rebounded substantially, but it's still then well below where it was in 2019, as indicated by the green line in the chart on the left. And then the next chart, please. Direct-to-consumer supply chains have shown growth. Statistics then for the country as a whole are hard to come by with respect to direct-to-consumer supply chains. There is some baseline information from 2015 from a nationwide survey that was conducted by USDA, just showing where these direct-to-consumer sales are taking place. A little less than half taking place at on-farm stores, and then about 1/4 at farmers markets. And then you can see roadside stands, community supported agriculture, the CSAs, online sales, which certainly have grown since the 6% in 2015. There was something interesting, in terms of just an indicator then of the growth that has taken place though as a result of COVID. The Florida Farm Bureau then maintains a list on its website of farms then that are selling direct to consumers. And you can see in early May then that there were about 230 some farms that were listed on that website. And that grew then to about 375 as of earlier this month. So certainly there's been growth there. The next chart, please. So what went wrong then with US food supply chains? Well, I think in a nutshell, it was the pursuit of efficiency at the expense of resilience. And if we could have the next slide, please. And perhaps the greatest problem here was the bifurcated or separate supply chains that we have then for products going to grocery stores and those going to food service outlets such as restaurants, schools, hotels, and so forth. These are largely different supply chains for grocery stores and food service, different farms then supplying to different markets, different processors, looking at products, and you can see some examples right here, all of them having different sizes, of course, then between grocery stores and food service, different packaging, as you can see, and then different labeling. All things then which make it difficult then for products that are destined to the food service market then to find a home in grocery stores. And just the example there in the middle. And so for food service with respect to milk, one important outlet then for milk is schools, where you will find the milk then served in paper cartons like the one shown in the figure here. Whereas if you go to a grocery store, of course, then you're looking for milk in a half a gallon or a 1 gallon jug typically. And the plants then, which are designed then to bottle milk in these plastic jugs, are not set up to do that with respect to these paper cartons and vice versa. And so that was part of the problem then, a good part of the problem that we saw with respect to dairy supply chains in the spring, and we're continuing to see. Next slide, please. And food supply chains, while they're not completely stable, are certainly more stable than supply chains in many other industries. The food industry as a whole is a relatively stable industry, since of course people have to eat. And we've never experienced anything like COVID-19 before, at least with respect to modern supply chains. And so in the stable environment then that we had prior to COVID-19, companies all along then food supply chains worked to optimize those chains. And part of the way that they did that was by minimizing the amount of inventory that they hold. Inventory is a cost, and in the pursuit of efficiency, that cost was reduced then to minimal levels. Along with that then was a very close matching of incoming demand and outgoing supply. So there was never any excess of product going out, nor a deficit. Stable buyer-seller relationships, which then discouraged firms, discouraged then companies from looking at other potential supply chain partners. And then in terms of shipping, optimized truck fleets then with minimal excess capacity. Making sure that each truck went out with a full load rather than any extra space. And so those things then gave supply chains for food products very little margin for error. And COVID-19 then just wreaked havoc on supply chains. Next slide, please. So what could be done now then to improve food supply chain resilience? And again, I'd like to offer just a little bit of guidance here from recent research that some colleagues and I are doing at Penn State. So the next slide, please. And so we are working then with a multi-layer network model of supply chains for products in general and food and agricultural products in particular. The figure on the right then illustrates generally how this model works. And so the different layers then in different colors that you see in the chart on the right then represent different industries. And so yellow would be one industry, green another, purple another, and so on and so forth. The dots then in those charts would represent different so-called nodes in these supply chains, different geographic locations where products are produced or consumed. And then the red arrows moving then between the different layers of the supply chain would represent then movements of products along supply chain from one industry to another. And so this multi-layer network model then can model the propagation of supply and demand shocks then along these supply chains. And so a shock would then propagate from one of these source nodes, one of these dots, to other nodes by either reducing supply or demand flows then to the other nodes. Next slide, please. What the network model results indicate in looking at the fragility risk then of selected different sectors then in the economy is that the sectors which exhibit the highest fragility risk, in other words, they're very fragile and they're also exposed to supply and demand shocks, are largely food and agriculture sectors, as you can see, such as animal feed, food manufacturing, meat, milled grains, transportation down at the bottom, important to all industries, of course, but agriculture in particular. And then a number of other industries in food and agriculture falling into the medium category. So of all the supply chains then that could be or could have been disrupted then by COVID-19, this model then indicates that the food supply chains were then among the most likely then to be disrupted. Next slide, please. So what are some of the implications then of the network model results? Well, for businesses, I think the model indicates that they should in general develop relationships with more supply chain partners and more geographically diverse partners as well, so that supply chain disruptions then in one part of the country do not propagate so rapidly to the and so significantly to the entire country. More flexibility then in production processes to shift between grocery and food service markets. Maintaining larger inventories, which of course for perishable food products can be an issue, but for those which are shelf stable, that can be done. Reducing exposure to shocks then through means which can be taken then, for example, and have already been taken then to protect workers on farms and in food manufacturing plants then from COVID. And then conducting stress tests of supply chain resilience. Simulation type models, such as the one that we have here, which could illustrate or demonstrate then the resilience or lack thereof of supply chains. For governments, I think one thing that could be done would be financial support then to develop and pilot test supply chain initiatives that increase resilience. Resilience, again, really hasn't been a focus in recent years of supply chains. The main emphasis has been on efficiency with some discussion of sustainability as well. But we need to add the third leg to that stool, which is resilience. And then also regulatory flexibility during crises to facilitate then shifts between the grocery and food service markets. And we did see a good deal of that with respect to the FDA then and USDA loosening up on their regulations during COVID to allow products then to move more quickly between those two different supply chains. And so with that, I'll thank you. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you and looking forward to any questions that you have.
Thank you, Dr. Abeler. Very interesting. Yeah, go ahead and while we're switching to the next slides, feel free to pop in any questions in the Q&A that you have for Dr. Abeler. And now we'll hear from Dr. Christa Court for her presentation.
Thank you, everybody. I'd like to also acknowledge my co-authors because everything that I'll present today was certainly not done by myself. So I was working with several other people from the Food and Resource Economics Department here at the University of Florida, John Lai, Andrew Rapicki, and our graduate research assistant, Bijeta Saha. Next slide, please. So before talking about the impacts of COVID-19 on Florida's agriculture and marine industries, I just wanted to hit on this point one more time about the size of agriculture in Florida. So our production agriculture is literally the A to Z of all commodity production in the US. So we often say alligators to zucchini or asparagus to zinnias, and we estimate that there's 200 to 300 different commodities produced throughout the state. Some form of agriculture is present in every county. We have over 47,000 farms operating on 9.7 million acres, and 95+% of these are family farms according to the 2017 Census of Agriculture. And you can see that by national rank, these different commodity groups were very highly ranked in things like vegetables, melons, potatoes, fruits, tree nuts, berries, and also nursery, greenhouse, floriculture, and sod. Next slide, please. So in addition, we've heard a lot about supply chains from the other speakers this morning. And in addition to production agriculture, Florida's also got robust food processing and distribution sectors. So there's 76,000 plus jobs in what we call food and kindred products manufacturing. That's things like food processing, the juice processing. And then over 1 million jobs in food and kindred products distribution. So these are things like the restaurants, the grocery stores, ways that we get food from the processors to the families at home or in food away from home. Next slide, please. So one of the things that our economic impact analysis program here within UF-IFAS produces is an annual report on the economic importance of agriculture, natural resources, and food industries to the state. So all encompassing it, and this would be that full supply chain, not just production agriculture, but there's direct employment of 1.72 million full-time and part-time jobs, and with direct industry output or sales revenues of over $175 billion. And when we account for what we call multiplier effects or the additional economic activity associated with supply chain purchases and employee spending, then our total output contribution is nearly $300 billion with a total employment contribution of over 2.4 million full-time and part-time jobs. So this is a significant contributor to Florida's economy. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this annual report. One of the other things that the Economic Impact Analysis Program has really been involved in since 2016 with Hurricane Irma's disaster impact assessment. So we've been involved in assessments for Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Michael. We were prepared to assess Hurricane Dorian. Luckily, it made that northward turn, and unfortunate for the Bahamas, but luckily for Florida, we did not have to do a full assessment then. And several freeze events in the winter of 2020. So, Florida is actually the leader in the country, along with Texas, in experiencing economic losses resulting from natural disasters. So it's estimated that we experience $5 to $10 billion in economic losses annually resulting from all types of natural disasters. So, we've heard, I don't have to spend too much time here because we've heard from a few other presenters about the demand issues related to COVID-19. So if we think about this food service industry demand, or the demand for food away from home, 54% of the money that individuals spend on food is spent on food away from home, according to data from 2018. And when those things were shut down, that was what was causing this big ripple that we've heard about from the others in terms of these bulk purchases from producers. The effect of social distancing and stay-at-home orders, demand for food in places like theme parks, restaurants, hotels, schools, all of those decreased, again, resulting in a decrease in these bulk purchases from many of the growers in Florida. A large portion of Florida's production goes into this hospitality and food service industries. One example that we often give is tomatoes grown in Florida alone. 80% of those go into this hospitality and food service industry. And so all of these things combined caused a major disruption to Florida's food system. Next slide, please. Just to hit home a little bit more, often people don't actually know or have any concept of the amount of food that South Florida produces. So Immokalee, Florida alone ships approximately 400 to 500 semi-trailer loads of vegetables each day from March to mid-May during that spring season. So that equates to 15 to 17.5 million pounds of vegetables going out of this one area in Florida every day. And it just happened to be when the COVID-19 pandemic shut down a lot of this bulk purchasing. They actually supply most of the food, or most of these fresh vegetables, up and down the East Coast of the United States and to international destinations. So when COVID-19 hit, one of the things, as the arbiter, I guess, of disaster impact assessment, people approached us and said, okay, what can we do to assess this disaster? And my initial reaction was, this has never happened before. It's a unique event. There's no way I can put a number on it nearly as quickly as I do something like a natural disaster. But after we, sat around for about a week of me saying there's nothing I can do, at that point, the situation evolved and we felt like we had to do something, and we had to start collecting information, even if it was a unique event, to try to be able to assess what was going on with Florida's agriculture and marine industries. So with those co-authors, I designed several survey instruments to harmonize collection of information of what was going on throughout these agriculture and marine industries, and we collected responses from April 16th to May 15th. Next slide, please. So the survey topics, we collected information on, just background about these operations, their revenues, their employment, what market channels they typically sell to. We asked about their current status. So when they were taking this survey in that April to May period, were they open or closed, or had they closed temporarily but reopened? If they were open, what were some business changes, or if they were closed, reasons for closure? Several types of impacts. We were asking about changes in revenue, changes in employment, changes in customer base, as well as products or services offered. And then whether they were willing to participate in potential follow-up or similar surveys for related businesses in the future. Next slide, please. Just in terms of overall participation, and I'm going to narrow down a little bit just to the food-related industries here in this presentation, but we had 5 different survey instruments: agricultural operations that included aquaculture, commercial fishing, seafood wholesale dealers, the for-hire charter, recreational fishing and diving industries, and then marine recreation support. And you can see here the number of responses that we got in each of those. And the darker colors on the map indicate where we received more responses for that particular sector. Next slide, please. In terms of agriculture respondents, we had 729 responses. 424 of them were what we would consider a full or complete response, but we didn't want to lose information. We allowed them to skip questions if they'd like to, and we used as much of the data as possible from those other 305 incomplete responses. About half of the production operations were small businesses, according to the definition that USDA uses in terms of sales revenue. And many of the businesses were open or operating in some capacity. 90% of them reported that they were open in any of these production, post-harvest, or transportation sectors that they reported from. Next slide, please. So if we look at a summary of the changes in sales revenue, we can see here the navy blue lines, or the dotted lines, are the full range of responses that we got. So you can see that some, at least one respondent in each of these commodity groups had lost everything or was down 100%. But almost all of them had respondents that were doing better during the coronavirus situation. So when we take an average of those or look across all of them, we can see that the average, or those orange bars that are shown there, is negative, and the sales revenues are down across all of the commodity groups. Next slide, please. So we took into consideration what's the typical sales revenues for these different commodity groups, what percentage of their activity typically happens in this March to mid-May window when they were being affected, and then calculated an output level at risk. Using those percentage losses that we collected from the survey, we were able to say that there's about $894 million of sales revenue losses associated with the coronavirus pandemic, just in Florida and just in that March to mid-May period. Next slide, please. Just very quickly, this will give you an idea of, I'm speaking about commodity groups, and there was only certain industries that we were able to pick up a commodity level effect that had enough responses. But again, we see that they're quite variant even within a commodity, but all of an average for each of them is significantly down between 20 and 75%. Next slide. Final thoughts. We've heard from the others. It was all about sales, markets, and prices. Next slide, please. And then, I'll just quickly, if you'll go to the next slide, because I know I'm running a little bit low on time. In terms of commercial fishing, we saw that they were seeing significant decreases in activity as well across all of the targeted species. You can see there 60 to 75% change in revenue over this period. Next slide. And those revenue losses, we estimated somewhere in the $23 to $27 million. In this February to May, they were seeing impacts a little bit earlier than agriculture. Seafood wholesale dealers, same story, set down in sales revenues. And we did not have baseline data for them to estimate an actual dollar value of sales revenue losses, but we're in the midst of collecting that so we can do it in the next round. Next slide. I'll just touch on labor issues. Labor capacity was a problem. We have a small window for harvesting fruits and vegetables. Specialty crops that we grow here in Florida are labor intensive and need large crews for workers. We've heard all about labor safety this morning, as well as some initial concerns about immigration and travel related to domestic and international travel restrictions. Next slide. So this just very quickly, it's not the end of our effort. We're preparing to release the detailed report on those round 1 results. Round 2 is live right now. So we're continuing to capture continued and new impacts in this quarter 2. And we have a collaboration between UF, Florida Gulf Coast University, and Florida A&M University to collect the stories behind these impacts. So I'm usually a data person, but we have interviews running through mid-October with stakeholders all across the food supply chain to try to tease out, what we can learn, stories behind those numbers. And now we're running into compound disaster assessment. We had Hurricane Sally this week, so we're busy assessing that as well and trying to make sure we tease out the impacts from one versus the other. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Court. So we have about 5 minutes for some questions, and we have a few here in the Q&A. So this first question, I think it was directed more towards Dr. Abeler, but if either of you would like to take this question. It says, what have been the impacts on small farms versus larger farms, and how can small farms be supported through programs related to the supply chain?
Yeah, I think if we take a look at the dairy industry, just as an example, I think the smaller farms by and large have been hit harder. Uh, the smaller farms in the dairy industry tend to be higher cost operations, per unit of milk produced than the larger operations. And so they had less margin to give than when the farm prices collapsed, as they did this spring. And also the larger operations, in many cases then have been more proactive than in developing their own supply chains. And so many of the products then that you'll find sold direct from dairy farms to consumers, cheese or whatever it may be, are either larger dairy operations or combinations of medium-sized operations that are producing enough milk then to be able to produce a quantity of product sufficient for sale to retail customers. So yeah, in the case of dairy, it was the smaller farms, yes, definitely got hit harder.
Thank you, Dr. Abeler. This next question I think is for Dr. Court. How do you think COVID-19 will continue to impact the food system moving forward? What new impacts are you expecting to see in the next round?
So I think we're seeing impacts in different areas, right? We initially saw them in South Florida with this fresh fruit and vegetable production, and now coming into fall, there's different things in the ground or different things being harvested. Things in the panhandle that are now being impacted by Sally as well are things that would be harvested, peanuts, cotton, during this fall season. But what we're hearing out of South Florida is that the fall season of vegetables, they're planting as if it's a normal season. So I expect that the impacts will become less over time, that they're feeling more optimistic and the sales will recover. And, as Dr. Abeler mentioned, a lot of them are finding ways to cope with the pandemic or become more resilient and weather the risk a little bit more.
We have about 1 more minute, so if you guys could share maybe one tip, each of you, about what ways you think that ag and natural resource industries could prepare for possible future public health pandemics. Like you mentioned, Dr. Court, especially here in Florida, we feel prepared more so when hurricanes come, but what are some ways that we can think about preparing for public health pandemics in the future from what we've learned through COVID-19?
So I think just moving to be more resilient in general, being open to change, not doing things one exact way. We've heard a lot from the interviews that growers that thought about signing up to sell product online for 2 or 3 years now, but were hesitant, were able to make it happen within a month or 4 to 6 weeks, and they're optimistic that they will make decisions more quickly in the future. And I think that's the type of attitude that they'll need to have to weather it next time.
Thank you. Do you have any closing comments, Dr. Abeler?
Yeah, I agree certainly with what Dr. Court said. And, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think one thing that everyone along food supply chains, from farms then to at the end, grocery stores and restaurants, can do, I think, a little bit more to cultivate a wider range of supply chain partners. And in particular, a wider geographical range of supply chain partners, so that if one partner is experiencing some difficulties due to a future pandemic or epidemic, they're not left high and dry. So would be my one recommendation.
Thank you, Dr. Abeler, and thank you both for your great presentations. So that concludes session 6. And if you had any questions that weren't able to get answered throughout the duration of today, you guys can contact the presenters from today. Their contact information is shared in the program. You can also get those questions to the Ag Safety Center team, and we can help facilitate that as well. But now we are going to switch gears and have a roundtable discussion. So you'll actually need to log into another link that was sent directly to you. It was in the same email that you accessed this webinar. So we're going to give you 1 minute to go ahead and switch webinar links if you want to go ahead and log off and log on to that next one. And we're going to hear from Dr. Sebastian Galindo and his team on the roundtable discussion. Thank you.